And here we are live. Good morning. Good morning to everybody watching us on YouTube and LinkedIn, Facebook as well. Probably listening to us in Clubhouse because Clubhouse is another platform that we live stream on. And today we're going to talk about a couple of things, and we need to start with an apology because of my misunderstanding. And once again,
or my failure to communicate. So,
no.
yeah, no, and that's okay. And first of all, just apologies to everyone. I got my morning face on because for whatever reason I got up at 4 and I could not get back to bed. So
Oh
I'm
no.
running I'm running a little ragged, but I'm okay. I'm up. I got the adrenaline going for the podcast, so we're all good. So if I drift off into Never Land, you'll know why, right? So
Right.
yeah, so let me start with the apology. So the title says, what is it? What's the exact title?
Okay.
60-minute intro to Japanese business culture. Okay. It wasn't intended to say that we're going to train you in an hour on Japanese culture. The intention was more like, it should have been more like a question. Like, if you only had 60 minutes to brief someone from another culture who had never been to Japan and give them a quick overview, what would you absolutely include in the content? And we would invite anyone in the audience, type in your comments if you have ideas, because Maya and I are working through this ourselves. We have some challenges ahead, and that's one of them. And again, it was misunderstanding. I didn't communicate. And again, going back to the definition of communication by Edward T. Hall, it's not about sending the right message. It's about getting a desired response. And if you don't get a desired response, no matter how correct you think your message was, you still failed to communicate, and it's on the speaker. So I humbly apologize to everybody
Yeah.
and to Maya
And
for.
and I apologize to you, Tim, as well, because I was multitasking as well. So
See, we do that sometimes, and I'm guilty of it,
yeah.
which also is kind of side related. One of the reasons I don't like doing online seminars is because, one, you can't see the audience. You got to get the feedback, and I love the
Yes.
feedback. I feed off of it.
Mm-hmm.
Body language or laughter. You tell a joke. Did my joke did it bomb, or is everybody laughing? Stuff like that. You
Yes.
don't know, right?
Mm.
Um, and that's the challenge. Of course, the good part is you don't have to travel great distances to do it in person. So, there's trade-offs, right?
Yeah.
So, and so to that point, often Maya and I will advise someone, like if it's a client that wants a seminar, we prefer to keep the seminars short if they're online because there's attention spans and there's the distractions of the internet that we all have and we all succumb to. So our thought is always to break it up into chunks, part one,
Yeah.
part two, right?
Yes.
But in this case, we're in a situation where we have to do a 1 hour seminar to people who are like completely unfamiliar with Japan, and we want to do it right. But we want to hit the most important points. And anyone out there who can give us your thoughts, we'd really appreciate it. I have my own ideas, and you know, I'm happy to put some of those out there. But first, a word from our sponsor.
First, a word from our sponsor, and our first sponsor, a wonderful sponsor they have been, is from Kanchu. That is Kanagawa Chuo Jutaku and James Howell. They work in the area of real estate. They are based in Yokohama and work in the Kanto area. They also offer bilingual services. So if you have ideas and projects coming up your way in this area, please connect with James at james@kanchu.com and see how you can work with them. I'm sure that they'll do their best, even they'll go beyond that to meet your needs and to customize their services to you. So thank you for this, Tim.
And I'm going
And
to start out. Let me quickly answer Timothy Langley's question. Nobody complained. The only person who complained was Tim against Tim. I'm complaining to myself about it. Um, And we wanted to head it off so to prevent complaining, because I don't like clickbait or misleading headlines. It was all very innocent. It was just a miscommunication between Maya and me. So
Yeah.
no, nobody complained, Timothy, but thank you for asking. And hopefully by the end of this podcast, no one will complain. We're hoping. We want to keep your trust and be honest and be real, right?
Yeah.
So
Uh,
yeah, go ahead.
yes.
Yeah, go
No,
ahead.
I just wanted to mention that maybe this question from Timothy is like a tongue-in-cheek thing, you
Could
know?
be. Yeah, it could be tongue
Yeah.
in cheek. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Could be.
Yeah.
Um,
But I may have misunderstood again, so sorry for this.
and
If this is
Timothy,
the
if you
case.
want to complain, please feel free to do so. We will humbly bow our heads and apologize. So,
Yes. Yeah. And sorry to interrupt you, Tim, but
no,
yes.
no, no, that's okay. Um, so, I was mulling it over like, if
Mm.
I have to do one thing, of course, you always do the self intro. That's a given, right?
Yeah.
So people have a
Hmm.
feeling from who you are, where you came from, what your experience is. And then when I get into it, of course, you talk about the goals and all that. But I always have a disclaimers slide. And the disclaimers is to head off any misunderstandings that, first of all, when you talk about culture, you're talking about patterns of behavior and patterns of thought. But you're not implying that everybody, for example, that all Japanese people think the same way or behave the same way, and anyone who has lived in a foreign country. Maya and I have been here a long time. Between Maya and me, we have over 70 years experience in Japan, right? And we
Yeah.
have very close, intimate family members, and we have many, many Japanese friends. And the more you get to know Japanese folks, the more you realize how diverse they are, whatever it might look like on the surface. There's
Yeah.
there is so much diversity of thought, but there's also history, and there's also values. And I had a professor in college describe it this way. He goes, think of values as being on a matrix. In the left column are all the values, and at the top across is all the values. And some of the values we hold are not always consistent because we're human beings and we're inconsistent animals, right? And
Right.
sometimes one value clashes with the other value, and depending on the situation, one value gets precedence over the other. So
Hmm.
the easiest example I could give is, if you read the literature, people say the Japanese value harmony. Okay. And by the way, I think all people around the world value it. It's just how we prioritize it in different
Right.
situations.
Yeah.
Okay. So I
Hmm.
think it's a human value, right? And, but again, the West, they say we value the truth. Okay. And again, just because we value the truth doesn't mean we always tell the truth. Just because you value harmony doesn't mean you're always harmonious. Humans are
Yeah.
humans. Values are simply ideals
They are
that a
ideals.
given culture aspires to or believes you ought to do. Okay. So the example I give is, okay, so let's say I'm an American. I do value harmony, but I also value the truth. And I'll be honest, in most situations, I'll kind of opt for the truth. But again, it depends on the situation. But in some situations, I'll opt for harmony and say, okay, you know what? It's not worth it. It's not worth being right. It's not worth arguing. I don't have the energy. I'm just going to go along because it's not that important. I prioritize, right? So that's
Right.
a value clash. And depending on the situation, one is going to take precedent over the other, right? And that's
Right.
true of any culture, any human being. So again, getting back to the original point, if we say the Japanese do XYZ, we mean there's a tendency to do it.
Hmm.
But many of my Japanese friends would not necessarily do that. They check different boxes, but they still kind of what? What we call the Tatemaya bell curve. You know, Tatemaya is the truth for public consumption. And if you observe the Japanese Tatemaya bell curve, it's going to look very tight
Tight.
because
Yeah.
behavior and the is going to be very consistent. And there are reasons for all this. There's cultural reasons for it. But if you look at the Hone bell curve, which
Mm-hmm.
is one's true feelings, that bell curve starts flattening out, right? So
Yeah.
what appears on the surface isn't always, almost is never the reality, right? Yeah, under the surface, right?
Yeah.
So that's my disclaimer. Like, we're not stereotyping people, but there are observable patterns of behavior that are helpful to understand. There are assumptions, there are expectations that need to be understood. So I've always included some kind of disclaimer like that in every seminar I've ever done. Actually, early on, I didn't, and I started getting pushback. So I realized, okay, I have to clarify
Right.
up front that I'm not
Yeah.
stereotyping. Any thoughts on that, Maya?
First of all, I want to say that nobody likes to be stereotyped, right? And
Right.
that's why it is great that you started with the disclaimer, Tim. And we always need to remember how much diversity there is. I wanted to add another point to what you just said, that as you mentioned, so the Tatemae and Honne bell curves are different. So the Tatemae bell curve is tighter, and that is because of many different reasons. There is peer pressure, there is that willingness to perform and everything. But the other one, which is the Honne, which is the real feelings and thoughts of people, is much flatter. It's not as flat as the American one,
Right.
maybe,
Right.
right?
Right.
But it's
Right.
still much flatter. And the thing is that we as foreigners, especially in my case, it took me actually several years to understand that that
Right.
bell curve is flatter than the Tatemaya one. Because, well, in Japan, people really are very big on trust building, on relationships, and
Right.
it's the same. It doesn't matter that we are foreigners. So basically, even Japanese people among themselves, they take time to build trust. They take time to build relationships. And maybe for us, in my case particularly, I didn't understand that in the beginning, so it felt like much longer. But I guess it's probably the average length. It needs, building a relationship needs actually here in Japan. So once you know that, and you realize how different the timeline is, let's say timeline here in Japan is, I think that it will be easier for anybody actually to work here, probably strategize in their relationships. When I say relationships, I don't mean private relationships, I mean business relationships, because we're talking about business culture here.
Right.
Yes.
And I think that's a really good segue to answer Ryan Shaw Jumat. I hope I'm saying your name right. Apologies if I'm not. What's the biggest difference? Again, it's hard for me to pick out one thing, but we touched on right now. Maya just touched on a very important one. That is the importance process oriented / relationship building. And a lot of my compatriots tend to be very transactional. You go in, you give them your proposal, you give them your price, you try to sell it as best you can. And I learned early on working for a Japanese company, my Japanese boss, he was all about relationships. He goes, you got to take the long term, Tim. You got to get to know them, and you really have to develop that relationship first. And as you said, Maya, a relationship of trust. So then the question is, how do you build trust? And you build trust. I mean, there's a lot of factors, being respectful,
Mm-hmm.
but mostly it's keeping your promises, keeping your commitments. And if you say you're going to do something, you do it. I When I worked in factories and our line was down, we would stay up all night, and I stayed for the peer pressure because I was in a Japanese team, and we would work all night to get that line up and running. And the Americans would be like, and Americans work hard. I'm not getting it wrong, but in their mind, they're saying the customer will forgive us, which they won't. And if they're a Japanese customer, if they're an American customer, yes, they're probably more forgiving, right?
Right.
I've seen this in snowstorms. I was
Mm-hmm.
working as a consultant in a factory in the middle of Indiana, rural Indiana. I woke up in the morning, there was a snowstorm. And I got to work because I had a really good four-wheel drive Subaru, and it was only 5 minutes away. Of course, it took me 20 minutes to get there, but I got there. And half the workforce was there,
Mm-hmm.
which meant we had a line that was behind on shipments. And if we didn't get the shipment out, it was going to shut down our customers' line, their customer, my customers' line, right? And I'm the consultant. We're doing industrial engineering kind of work. We're doing Kaizen stuff, right? We're
Right.
managing a team for improvement. So we're sitting there. They gave us our own room. We wore uniforms of our client. And suddenly the Japanese president, this is in the US again, he runs in and he goes, Taihen, big problem. The line is down. We have to get it up and running. Half the workforce is here. Can you help us run the line? So all of us, these high-paid consultants and our team, because we knew the line, we were improving it. We go out there, roll up our sleeves, and we're making
Right. Yeah.
we're making dashboards, and we're
Mm-hmm.
slow, we're terrible because we're not trained operators, and we put trained operators in charge of us. So they were, regular employees, but they were good operators, and they were making fun of us. They thought it was the funniest thing they ever saw. But on my left is the Japanese president. On my right is the Japanese vice president. And we're all out there showing the effort to meet that commitment to a customer. The American managers were saying, hey, man, stuff happens. I'll call my buddies at the client and they'll give us a pass. They won't be that mad. And 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 it was probably true
Yeah.
because the customer was a Japanese owned American, it was a Japanese owned transplant that employed lots of Americans who tended to interface with the Americans that are in my client's company, right?
Yeah.
And yet the Americans like, no problem. We'll give you a pass today and everything's good, which is very nice of them. However,
Yeah.
the Japanese guys in that company would call the Japanese guys in my client's company and scold them and say, what, you're not keeping your commitment, right?
Right.
So again,
Yeah.
this is just one example of the level of concern in
Mm.
really keeping those commitments.
Yes. Yeah. Indeed. Well, I think I have 2 points to make actually. One of
Sure.
them is about respect, and you mentioned it in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that most people want to show respect, but the thing is, once again, how we show it, right? And how it is understood. Because in the United States, people come across as more aggressive, sometimes
Yeah.
that, right? They're outspoken, and sometimes that outspokenness comes across also as arrogant, which is not the case. Most of the time, it
Right.
isn't.
But
But
that's how it's perceived.
it is how it is perceived, yes. And I was very worried about this when I came to Japan and started working, and I was still going to my Japanese language classes. And I was just in the beginning of my Japanese language studies back then, and I was worried that my keigo, that is the honorific Japanese that you use in business settings, is not good at all. And then I
Yeah.
talked with my teacher and I said, I really don't know what to do because my keigo is very bad. I
Yeah.
don't know how to use it, and it's really terrible. And she said, you don't have to worry about that so much because if you show your respect to the people around you, if you're humble and
They'll
respectful,
feel.
they'll feel it. And feelings here in such situations are better than they do much more for you than the words you use, because once again we go to the point that the language can be used either as a tool or as a weapon. So
Yeah.
that's another thing. But
And my,
yeah.
my Keigo isn't great either, even now after all these years. I mean, still you can use the Moss form. And so I used to give all these seminars. And one thing that I had going for me, from their point of view, I was the sensei. And I'm not, an eraso kind of guy, but so they cut me slack because I really didn't have to be super polite. But I would always, in my intro, I would just say, いや、本当に敬語勉強不足ですので、本当に申し訳ございません. I didn't study my Keigo enough, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I don't use it properly. And the Japanese are so forgiving. If they see that sincerity and humility up front, they cut you a lot more slack than maybe they should. But they're very kind that way. Sometimes they cut you so much slack that they won't tell you if you made a mistake, and then it takes longer to learn it. It took me many years to learn certain basic things because I wasn't getting the right feedback. They were
Yes.
just being polite and the foreigner, he doesn't know, right? Um,
And
so
that's okay, it's
yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. No,
right?
they're
Yeah.
so sweet. That's what I mean. I think the Japanese are very forgiving. If as
Very
long as
forgiving.
you,
Yeah.
like you said, you show that
Yes.
sincerity. And by the way, Kei Izawa, thank you for your comments.
Yes.
Great,
Yeah.
completely. That you nailed it with that. It really is
Yes.
I wasn't familiar with the term rental sekini, but I understand collective responsibility,
Yeah.
combined with peer pressure because that's what's expected of
Yeah.
you as well.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, America has it, but less. And I completely agree with you because
Yeah, this is, yeah, if you don't mind me jumping in here, this is the second point I actually wanted to make. And thank you, Kei-san, for jumping in. And this is tying this up to, Ryan's question earlier. So what is the biggest difference between, or the most vital difference between American and Japanese business cultures? And I would say there are many, many things, but probably the one, yes, the one which is really so obvious to everybody who comes here is this. So the American business culture is individualistic and the Japanese business culture is group oriented. So, and this is once again coming to rentai sekinin, I believe, because with the group orientation, you
oh, it's
have this,
rentai. I'm sorry, I
yes,
misread it. It looked like rental. I was trying to figure out. Okay,
no,
rentai
yeah,
say. Oh,
rentai
yeah, there.
sekinin,
I see it in the kanji now. Okay, sorry about that. Go ahead,
yes.
Maya.
Yeah, and basically everything, every team or every division, every department, every company, they are a team in their own. So, and it also, of course, is related to the Japanese traditional values of, yeah, probably this understanding of soto to uchi, that is the inner group and outer group, and the history of feudal Japan and even the history before that, they have, created this orientation to working in groups, and doing things for the community. And of course, once again, here comes, the peer pressure. When you are in a team or in a group, in a community, you have your responsibilities and you have to perform. So if you do not perform, then what happens is that you inconvenience everybody else in that
Right,
team or in that
right.
group. And people don't want to do that to their peers, right?
Yeah,
Because there are consequences for that. And I would say that probably the biggest difference is this individualism versus group orientation. But these come with a lot of other
yeah, a little.
things.
Yeah,
Yeah,
a lot of other things, and more specific things. Again,
more
back to
specific.
Kay's
Yes.
point,
Yeah.
the idea of collective responsibility is just so baked into the
Mm.
cake, right?
Yes.
And even the way our work is structured is a
Mm-hmm.
huge difference. The way it's structured and allocated.
Yeah.
So, in an American company, I would be given a very specific, narrow job description. And Tim, it's, let's say it another way, an individual job description. Individualism makes sense, right? And everybody's got their own job description. And if
Mm-hmm.
everybody does their part,
Yeah.
then the wheels on the machine will turn properly. And if one person does it, you take it out and replace it, or you improve it, or you fix it, right?
Yeah.
And so then I go into a Japanese company, and my boss said, "Your job description is to do whatever the company needs to make it better." And he was half joking, but he really wasn't. And really, our department had a job description,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody had a pretty good idea what needed to be done, but not necessarily, oh, is that my job or not? If you see something that needs to be done, you jump in and you do it. And it was actually very proactive, at least the world I lived in.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked the proactiveness because I could kind of write my own job description. I could say,
Right.
Okay, I've never done that, but I want to try that. I'll do that. Let me try that job. And if I wasn't doing well, I just talked to my boss and he'd help me, and it all worked. It was this group effort, right? And
Yes.
so, and going hand in hand with that, you're feeling group responsibility to achieve the mission of the group, not just your job description.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's also one of the reasons, it's kind of an unspoken assumption. It's hard for Japanese to go home early if their teammates are still there. Because if you don't have a job description, you can't say, hey, my job's done. I'm going home. Good night. Good luck, you guys. No, if you leave, they're going to have to do work that you could have done, but now you're going to lose a little bit of face. And I felt that pressure
Mm.
when I worked with Japanese people. Um, so there's pluses and minuses, right?
Yes, there is. Yeah, there are always
There's always pluses and minuses,
yes.
right?
Yeah. Mm.
Um, so I've used this metaphor before, but I think it's very useful. If you've ever drank with Americans versus Japanese, the Americans, we all order a beer. Each person orders whatever beer they like because we're individuals. And then the beers are packaged in individual sizes. And then, so each person gets the beer that they want, or whatever drink it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's good. And I'm responsible for drinking my beer and ordering another beer if I want it. And it's, again, those are the rules. Everybody agrees on them. There's nothing wrong with it. But when you drink with the Japanese, first of all, forget individualism. There might be 6 big bottles of Kirin or Sapporo or whatever the beer is chosen, and there's little teeny weeny little glasses.
Yes. Mm.
And this is the unspoken rule. You have to take care of everybody except yourself. That's kind of how work is too. And you look around for empty glasses to fill, and before somebody asks you, you proactively pour
Mm-hmm.
it, and don't worry, they'll pour yours. Okay,
Yes.
we're already at halftime. Don't worry,
Ah,
they'll
yeah.
pour yours.
Mm.
And so, in other words, each member of the team is focused on all the other team members. And I know a lot of Japanese who actually hate that custom because it's a pain. You're always busy looking for beers to pour. But I kind of like it, but I understand why some of my Japanese friends are frustrated with it. But I like that as a metaphor because that's kind of how I worked. And again, this is manufacturing, my bubble that I lived in. I was always looking for stuff to do. And I kind of got used to it because, again, I could kind of write my own job description and I could do stuff maybe an American company would never let me try, right? So I
Right.
saw it as freedom in some ways, very,
Mm-hmm.
very liberating, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a good metaphor in terms of work dynamics and team play. You're focused on the group and the collective mission of the group
Mm-hmm.
more than you, the individual. Again,
Yes.
sometimes to a fault, but I could say it both ways, right?
Right. And also, once again, it's not, we're not saying this to just claim that every single person here
Right.
does that, because I also remember that several years ago, I had a colleague, and one day, of course, she was asked to do something, and she said, "That's not my job." And then my boss, he was really like he was so frustrated. And how could she say that, that wasn't her job? And then that was, it came like an unexpected surprise, but well, whatever. So eventually we found somebody else to help us with that project. But again, what Tim said, we go back to the disclaimers. Yes, there are tendencies here, and not everybody is doing exactly the same thing. So that the stereotype that the Japanese people are all the same doesn't hold water at all.
Or anybody for that
Or
matter,
anybody, yeah,
right, right,
yes,
right. For
yeah,
anybody, but definitely with the Japanese too, right? And
right, yeah,
so I maybe we should jump to the commercial. I can come back and just some of the
yes.
things I think are important in terms of understanding. You
Mm-hmm.
know, go ahead, Maya. Let's bring in our esteemed sponsors.
Yes, and our next sponsor is Houze. So they are also based in Yokohama. You can find them online as Houze Inc. And they do work in Kanto, the Kanto region, in Tokyo and Yokohama predominantly. They offer bilingual services once again in custom home design, construction, and renovations. They also do commercial building construction, so please do not hesitate to reach out to Hana Urushizawa Howell on LinkedIn. Or you can also email her at hana@kanachu.com. She represents both companies and she speaks both English and Japanese. So if you're worried about your Japanese, do not. So she will be there for you. Thanks a lot. And Tim, let's continue now.
Yeah, I one of the things I think is really important to understand is process orientation, focus on process, right?
Right. Mhm.
And you know, it has deep roots in Japan. If you look at Zen Buddhism, which is a derivative of a certain Chinese Buddhist sect that also had influence from Taoism,
Yeah.
and if, a lot of these religions, ancient religions, they got they were cross fertilized with other thought processes, right?
Yes.
And so, I mean, if you look at the Tao, and people have been familiar with that. Some people who don't understand might say, "Oh, is that their God?" No, Tao is written like Michi or the way, right?
The way. Mm.
Which implies not necessarily a supreme being, but a process, right? That
Yeah.
everything's a
Yes.
process. And if you look at Zen Buddhism, right, the way of the warrior, the way of the swordsman, the way of tea, they're all talking about process. How you do something is very, very important. And the thought, while my compatriots are like, hey, as long as you get a good result, who cares? And there are times when I think that's a very useful way to look at the
Mhm.
world, because it gives you freedom to do trial and error. And sometimes Japanese people get married to the process a little bit too much,
It
uh,
happens. Yeah.
many, many reasons that we probably don't have time to go into, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I saw this consistently, again, especially in manufacturing, and I would argue that the process orientation really served Japan well in becoming very good at manufacturing. Yeah,
Yeah.
they look at that process very carefully and they analyze it. And the idea is, if you do the process right, you're going to get the desired result,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
Process orientation in relationship building. Focus on building relationships of trust. The outcome will come later, right?
Yes.
So yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. No, I wanted to say to add to that because process orientation also implies that things here take longer to happen, right?
Yes.
So, of course, planning of any execution takes much longer than it takes in the Western world, and there is this ratio 80 to 20%, and it's more or less correct. I mean. It is
Right.
variable, right? It varies
Right.
depending on the situation. But usually, here we see that 80% of the time of a project is dedicated on planning, and then 20% of that time is dedicated on execution of the project. But of course, once again, it varies. And I wanted to say one more thing that is really different when we talk about business is the long-term orientation versus the short-term
That's
orientation.
a good one. I like that.
So
Yeah.
in Japan, basically companies and corporations are much more oriented into achieving their missions, not so much goals,
Right.
concrete numerical goals, but their mission in the long term. And that mission usually involves points like serve the community or serve the society or make the society lives better or something like this, which is always related to the people and the environment in which the company operates. And then, of course, in Europe and probably more, even more so in the United States, the corporate world is much more fixated on short term gains and short term goals.
Next quarter.
next quarter.
next
Yes.
quarter's profits. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So this is another thing that probably all explains a lot of what goes on in the Japanese corporate world. And again, I'm not saying that Japan is right and the Western world is wrong. This is not what we want to relay in this conversation. The thing is that depending on the situation, there are good points and bad points. And of
Exactly.
course, when the situation changes, the good points may turn into bad points as well.
Right.
So flexibility, I want to say also that the Japanese, in this sense of the word, they have very flexible minds and they understand that depending on the situation, the reaction of the team may be different or should be different and so on. So it's nothing is set in stone here. And I believe it's the same in other countries as well. But judging by myself before, yes, before I came to Japan, I always thought, okay, I have made this decision and I'll stick to it, whatever happens. But that's not the case, actually. More often than not, we have to actually go with the mindset that things change and we need to adjust our decisions and everything to the changes in the environment. And I think that it's the Japanese are much better at doing this, even when they think about their long-term goals and missions, than we are back home.
Yeah. And the thing is, harmony is a beautiful thing, but if that's your ultimate value, it's really hard to be efficient when you value
Yes,
harmony,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that's if you look at again how decisions are made. Everyone talks about, the Japanese make consensus decision making and they take a long time and the reality based on what I've seen, I, yes, you spend a lot of time up front doing the nemawashi, which means digging around the roots, which is another way to say, before I take this plant in the garden and put it in another spot, if I just rip it out without any preparation and replant it, it might die of shock. So you dig around the roots, give it kind of a heads up that change is coming, and then when the farmer or the gardener feels the plant is ready, they make the transition and it thrives. And that's the analogy of nemoashi, or some Japanese, my bosses used to say chose suru, which they meant Japanese style coordination. But the word chose actually means adjust, which in itself is very
Hmm.
interesting. You're adjusting,
Yeah,
right?
adjusting. Yeah.
And I've said this many times. I sound like a broken record, but a lot of people really don't understand this. Consensus is not everybody agrees on the answer.
Hmm.
Consensus is you define the problem, you
Yeah.
define the question, and you reach agreement by talking to everybody who's going
Hmm.
to be affected by a given change in the organization. Before you make the change, you talk to everybody and say, how would this affect you from your point of view? Help me look at this situation from quality control's point of view, or from sales point of view, or from production controls point of view, whatever it is. And then you gather all this information and you make your taraki dai, your rough plan based on these inputs to
Hmm.
try to
Yeah.
mitigate any difficulties this change might cause, the meiwaku, the trouble it
Yes.
can cause, and you do your best to negotiate, sometimes appease, but mostly to take into consideration their point of view.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
when you finally put your plan together, or at least the current situation, you've got some consensus that everybody agrees, yep, this is the problem. And then you brainstorm. And
Right. Yeah.
yeah, this is the problem, and these are the options for corrective action. But
Hmm.
it's not democratic. You're not going to take a vote. Not everybody's going to be happy with that final answer, but people feel at least that they were heard. They got their fingerprint on defining the problem, or the Japanese like to say genjo haku, understand the current
Yeah.
situation.
Hmm.
And that's where, to use your percentage, again, we know it's flexible, but that's the 80% of it, right?
Yes.
And then,
Yes.
and then now, when you pull the trigger, and this is Peter Drucker said this. He goes, when the Japanese pull the trigger, they leave the Westerners in the dust, hanging on the ropes. But up until that point, to before they pulled the trigger, the Westerners are like, "Wow, those Japanese take forever. What's taking them so long?" And then, boom! Once they decide, it happens pretty fast. Implementation phase, right?
Yeah.
And his analogy was, yeah, Americans, we pull the trigger. You know, I call it fat, fast draw, slow bullet. We pull the trigger really fast, but we haven't got everybody on board. So sometimes
Hmm.
not everybody is as cooperative as you'd like them to be, or maybe they appear cooperative, but
Right.
they're
Yes.
passive aggressively resisting you. I've seen some of that in my day. Um, so he's like, sometimes, yeah, the Japanese might take longer, but sometimes Americans, it's not as quickly as they claim it to be, because really sometimes implementation comes off with a lot of
Yeah.
glitches. Now,
Yeah.
I'm generalizing, right?
Right.
And one
Yes.
more disclaimer. I like this method in a manufacturing setting where you have repetitive processes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because you really do want to fix the problems. But this process is very, very clunky in a fast moving, high tech situation where innovation is really important. And so sometimes the American way, the Western way, call it whatever you want to call it, sometimes it's better in certain contexts. It's sometimes you just got to move. And, here's one more example. A Japanese guy was telling me this too. He
Mm-hmm.
said, yes, we do tend to make pretty good decisions in the factory. But if something out of the blue happens, man, the Americans are so good. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, the other day we were in the factory and a faulty sprinkler burst, right? Now there's
Mm-hmm.
water going everywhere. He goes, the Japanese, he's talking about himself. And he goes, we were kind of frozen. We didn't know what to do, but the Americans just jumped in and right away fixed it. So when the sprinkler head bursts, you don't have time to do nemawashi. You don't have time to consult
Mm-hmm.
with everybody. You just got to do it. You just got to make a quick decision, right? And
Yeah.
I'd say a lot of stuff in the high tech industry, you got to keep moving real fast. So again, we're
Mm-hmm.
not saying one way is better than the other, but I think in certain situations you could argue,
Yeah. Right.
one is over the
Yeah.
other. So just go ahead, your turn.
Oh, yeah. No, I wanted to add that they have also this saying, "Isoge bamaware," right? So
Yeah,
if you are in a hurry, take the long road. So,
yeah, yeah.
and it is once again, I'm not talking about industries like the IT industry, right? Or
Right,
finance
right.
or so on, where really the decision making should be brisk and to the point. But yeah, just in manufacturing, so the processes have served Japan very well.
Yeah,
And also, I mean, in agriculture as well. When you
right,
think about
right.
agriculture, everything is, based on specific processes there. And those processes, basically, thanks to them, we've got the most delicious strawberries in the world. And not only, of course, we've got the apples and everything. I don't know whether you have traveled actually to Aomori and Yamagata in
Years
autumn.
ago, years ago,
Okay.
something
In
like that.
autumn, I was really surprised. It was actually late summer. Sorry, not really autumn, but when we were there and we were driving along country roads, I was really shocked to see how every single apple was packed in a paper bag.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, in apple tree fields, orchards that were acres and acres big.
yeah.
And how do you do that? It requires, you cannot do it with a machine, but this is part of the process, and the people there do it so that we get all those delicious apples that look beautiful and they taste just like something you haven't tasted before.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to say with this is that basically processes are good, and when you have the time to do that, and it is important to follow them. And also following, for example, in companies, there is a lot of bureaucracy in Japanese companies when it comes to human resources as well. But I can say that while in the beginning I was very much against that bureaucracy, I understand that it serves a purpose, because bureaucracy, if it is not overboard, once again, this is a disclaimer, because
Right.
sometimes, it gets overboard and it's
Yeah.
just, you know, make you stumble and everything. But if there is, a good balance between the bureaucracy in human relations and then, freedom of movement, then it's great because people understand the rules. And when everybody adheres to the rules, observes them, the harmony, doesn't suffer.
Right.
And
Right.
yes, I think this is another aspect of the Japanese business culture that hasn't been appreciated very much because coming from Western countries, it feels like overbearing sometimes. It
Yeah.
feels it, but
Yeah.
it serves a purpose.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, when you get used to it, it really feels comfortable
Yeah.
and good for everybody on the team or in the organization.
If you get used to it, and you got to be patient. If you're not a patient person, then it can be
Right? Yes.
frustrating. And I acknowledge that I've been frustrated, you know.
Me
And the
too.
other, yeah, and the other thing is, and this kind of segues into another point that when I was still less sophisticated in my knowledge about how Japanese did business early on in my career. Again, I was working for a company, Noritsu Kyokai, Japan Management Association, and my Japanese boss. And I made this comment one day. I go, "Yeah, man, the Japanese are so efficient." I was thinking like Toyota, Honda, right?
Right.
And he looked at me. He's like, "We're not efficient. We're the most inefficient people in the world." He goes, "Don't judge it based on Toyota and Honda, because most of that we study from America. Henry Ford, you know, Frederick Taylor, the efficiency experts, of
Yes.
course, Deming, the Drucker." He goes like, "We learned that." He goes, "But we're really inefficient," and he's right. Like they can be extremely inefficient, but there are roots to that as well. And I think the Japanese, at least used to, value effectiveness over efficiency. Of course, they
Mm-hmm.
want to be efficient if they can, but effectiveness, that end result, is
Yeah.
very, very important to them. And getting it right and hiring people to put those apples in paper bags and, you know, presenting it aesthetically or whatever way you want to present it, taking
Yeah.
time to show
Mm.
that you care. And there's good things to say about both, right?
Yes.
But you were talking about Japanese adaptability. Look at, in spite of that less emphasis on, let's call it, labor efficiency,
Mm-hmm.
they became more and more efficient in labor in the context of a factory.
Yeah.
They learned, they adapted and made it fit. But again, I always used to say, you go in the factory, it's pretty efficient. You go in the front office, it's a bunch of rice farmers. And the reason I say rice farmers is rice farming was a way of survival in Japan and all the East Asian countries, right? That was their roots.
Yes.
And Japan had no natural resources except one, lots of people. And so they were focused on yield,
Mm-hmm.
not efficiency. And they worked long hours in those rice paddies because you got to pull the weeds and you got to make sure you got to monitor very closely the health of your crops. You have to diversify your crops, just in case one strain, has problems a certain year, and the other strain can help out and compensate. And it turned out the Japanese at one point had the highest yield per acre isn't the right word because I'm using the American way, but you know,
Mm-hmm.
per plot of land, they had the most yield of rice than even compared to the other Asian countries. And of course, I'm sure they learned it from China originally. So I think the roots are you know yield over necessarily labor efficiency, and that
Mm-hmm.
had to be a learned behavior. I think
Yes.
certainly post-industrial, industrial Japan when they industrialized.
Right. Yes, I agree. And I have been asked many times, so like it doesn't sound good, but are you a Japan apologist? Which is really a bad question because I'm in love with the country and in love with, such long-term orientation, with the process orientation and everything. Even though for the first several years here, I was in. totally frustrated. It took me time to understand why things happened in this way and so on and so on. But once you understand the reasons and how they work and their benefits, eventually you become to appreciate them, right? And I want to say once again that it's not that there aren't things that couldn't be improved. There are a lot of things that can be improved. But then at the end of the day, you think, what is the end result, right? Do we want the Japanese corporations to think about the next quarter only and then entirely
Right.
ignore the contribution they have been making to their communities, right? Or do we really want people just to say anything that comes to their mind right there, right in your face and everything? So civility and politeness are probably very highly valued here in Japan, and I have become to learn to know I value them too. But again, so it depends on the situation, and it depends on what the task at hand is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and the other point, to your point, and then maybe we could move to the next topic a little bit. But you're talking about you're frustrated, and yeah, if we could make Japan, but it's not our job to make Japan, to change Japan,
no,
nor do
it
we nor
isn't.
do we have the power, even if we thought we
Right?
could.
Yeah.
So why focus on what you can't control? You got to learn to go with the flow. You got to learn to
Mhm.
adapt yourself. And if you don't like it, like people would say, I hate working for this Japanese company. I'm like, okay, well, you don't have to work here. And I didn't mean it
It's
in a nasty way, but if it doesn't mean you're a bad person. If you say I don't like to work for a Japanese company, don't torture yourself. Go find an
right.
American company to work for, right? Um,
Yeah.
because you're not going to, I mean, you may be able to make changes. I'm not saying you can't influence the process,
Hmm.
but you're not going to do it by complaining. And, you're definitely not going to do it by complaining. So, I same with the, by the way, I've worked for Japanese and American companies. I don't like working for any company now. And American companies had their pluses I loved, and there were a lot of minuses. And the Japanese had their pluses that I loved, and the minuses. And the pluses aren't the same, and the minuses aren't the same when you compare
Right.
the
Yeah.
two. Um, but for me, I'm just a lone wolf, and I decided I was better off on my own, and so I went. You know, but complaining doesn't help, right? So,
No, it
um,
doesn't.
and
Yeah.
focusing on what you can't control, it's just an exercise in frustration. So,
Yes, and
yeah,
I want to make, yes, another point here, because some people say that gayatsu usually helps, right?
sometimes,
And I
sometimes.
would say that sometimes it does, it's not usually, okay? So basically, gayatsu, if it is done well, strategically, probably it helps in certain situations. But most of the time, when it is, just straight blaming in things
Yeah,
here and people for not doing this or, not understanding this or that, it usually has the opposite effect.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's why, yeah, just thinking that if you put pressure on somebody here openly, pressure on somebody is going to help you, you will be in for a big disappointment, I should say.
yeah. All right.
So,
So
yeah,
let's pivot a little bit because
let's do that. Yes.
yesterday I was just doing a mental exercise in preparation for this, and this is just random stuff I'm thinking about, so it's not all organized, right? But I
Yeah.
was thinking about, like, if you go down to core values, like what does one culture value versus what does the other culture value, right?
Yeah.
Here's another thing I would tell people who don't understand Japan. If you really want to understand Japan, first of all, understand your own culture first. Figure out who you are to create that self awareness, because otherwise, you're going to do what I did early on, project your values unconsciously onto Japanese and assume that they value the same things and hold the same assumptions. And of course, that's all invisible and below the surface. So that was my mistake, because I didn't realize who I was as a person, as an American. And I made a really good first step when I started understanding, oh, these values that I hold near and dear are unique to America or unique to Western culture. and they don't necessarily apply to Japanese culture, certainly not in the same situations where I think they should, you know. So that was like it was a mind-blowing experience studying American culture as an American, right? And so
Right.
I think everybody should do that. So I was thinking of some values though that should or should not be mentioned. Again, it's time constraints, but there's this value on purity, which is cleanliness. The Japanese tend to be very clean. They tend
Mm-hmm.
to, you know, they like your desk to be orderly. Doesn't mean I knew some Japanese with messy desks, but they kind of want that your desk to be orderly. The factory's always spotless. There's, you know, the office is clean. We used to do once a week, every Friday, without anybody saying at a certain time. People would get on, you know, start dusting and cleaning, you know.
Yeah.
So I think purity or cleanliness, you know, seiketsu.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mentioned process orientation. And by the way, the purity comes from Shinto, even though the Japanese aren't conscious of it necessarily. Process orientation comes from Buddhism, but probably rice culture too. You know, you have to follow a process if you want to get the desired result. And if it's rice cultivation, then if you don't get it, you're in big trouble because you're going to starve to death. So you got to get it right, right?
Yeah.
We talked about value and harmony, Confucianism, but again, I think it's baked into rice culture because Confucianism was born out of rice culture as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I mentioned reciprocal obligations.
Right. Yes. Mm.
You know, if I give someone a gift, they're going to give me a gift back. If I do someone a favor, they're going to feel indebted to me, or vice versa. If they do a favor for me, there's this unspoken assumption that now I have to reciprocate somehow, and whether you want to or not, right? And this is the what locks people in. And so many people told me, like, I don't know how do I approach the Japanese? I'm kind of afraid of them, and I they never their faces a poker face. I don't know what they're thinking, and this was like they were what often baffled, like what I do is my first move, and I used to tell them, you already know what to do. Just
Yeah.
go out of your way, proactively do something kind for them.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's a gesture, just offer something to help them, to solve a problem, to, you know. And the example I would give is whenever we'd have a new Japanese guy come to the US for his, it was always a he, unfortunately, for his 2 to 5 year stint, the very first day at work, this is before cell phones and all that stuff, I would introduce myself. I give him my business card, right, very politely with two hands, and I'd say, if you ever have any issues here in the U.S., you call me anytime. My number, my home phone number's on the back. My wife's Japanese. If your wife's with you, my wife can take your wife out and show you all the places to shop for Japanese food and where the good restaurants are. And sometimes they took me up on the offer, sometimes they didn't, but they all felt, oh, he's
Mm.
got my interest, but you know, my best
Yeah.
interest at heart, and it would give them a positive impression, and it was a good first step in the relationship by reaching out to them.
Yeah.
So I think
Mm.
and reciprocal obligations is not only peers, it's the senior guy needs his or her subordinates, and they need everybody in the ranks in that organization to survive. Everything's interlocked. That's the, you know, that binds people, right? Again, Confucianism. Um, Keeping promises, we mentioned. That's how you build trust.
Yeah.
If you make a promise, keep it. And if you don't, very sincerely apologize, you know. Don't make excuses. I mean, if you can sneak in a reason, you can, but still you gotta say, but that's no excuse, you know, and moshiwake gozaimasen, which is a polite way to say you're sorry. And a literal translation of moshiwake gozaimasen is there's no excuse. You know, you're like admitting up front literally that there's no excuse for this. And then you take action to quickly rectify the matter. And sometimes you can build more trust because you
Yeah.
showed sincerity, you humbly apologized, and then you took action. You showed them that they were concerned. And therefore, because of that knowledge, I don't make big promises. I always try to under promise and over deliver. And I think most Japanese instinctively, without even thinking about it, I think that's the tendency
Yeah.
in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And to the point of building relationships, there's this distrust of strangers, outsiders, even outsiders that might be another Japanese person. If they're
Yeah.
not in your inner group, they're not just going to openly accept you. You have to earn your way in. And so it's on you to I don't want to say ingratiate, but to earn the trust to, and you do it by keeping promises, connecting with people, doing helpful things. It's not rocket science, but I understand why it might be scary for some people. And then the other thing we touched on is collectivism versus
Mm.
individualism. We gave some examples. So those were kind of, I just quickly listed some values that I think are important, but if anybody has any other, or Maya, you want to add to that list?
Oh, no, I think that you pretty much summed it up, right? And yeah, it's also 9 o'clock now. So
Could
that's,
see we couldn't even scratch the surface in an hour. So we didn't deliver on our promise of our title. Moshiwaki gozaimasen. We'll do it next.
right. Yes.
So,
Yeah, just I wanted to say that in Japan, if you are humble and if you apologize, then people are much more open, and they are open to, what do you say in English? Give you some slack?
cut you some slack.
Oh, cut you some slack.
They're
Yes.
very kind. If
Yes.
you're, yes, I
Very
agree.
kind. And yes, because yeah, promises, they know that promises sometimes cannot be kept, but for that, if you do it once and apologize, then it will be fine. But if you do the same thing consistently, then probably you're not going to be part of that community for much longer. But
Right.
yeah, you're right. So it's really situational once again. And
Yeah.
if you want to learn more, let us know, Tim and me, so that
Yeah.
yeah,
We can
we'll be
cover all.
happy.
Right.
Yes.
And just to your last point, so in my seminars, I used to ask both Japanese Americans, make a list about the things that frustrate you about the locals and also the nice things. And the Japanese had a lot of nice things to say about Americans, really hardworking. They were surprised because the media made them think that Americans were lazy. So they were really, very surprised, pleasantly surprised, and were very, they often, homiteta, they often praised,
Mm-hmm.
Americans. But one thing I heard a lot, especially in the customer service sector, they would say the American employees don't always keep their promises. They
Mm.
don't apologize when they break a promise, and then they make excuses. And so I used to train American customer service people to say, okay, this is their negative stereotype of you, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, strategically, you need to know that. Therefore, do the opposite. Keep your promise. If you break a promise, apologize right away and don't make excuses, and then take action. And you can actually build a stronger relationship with your customer. They forgive failure as long as it's handled the proper way.
Yeah.
And some of it goes back to collective responsibility versus, individual. Oftentimes some need of the customer will not be fulfilled, but it wasn't your fault personally. They don't care. And they probably know it wasn't your fault personally. But the apology, you're expected on behalf of the collective, on behalf of the company, whether it's your fault or not, to apologize. Moshiwaki gozaimasen. I will rectify the matter. So I think Americans often are afraid to admit their individual responsibility because they might think they may be penalized down the line for doing it, versus in
Right.
Japan, you're just expected to do that for the collective. So I know we
Yeah.
got to we got to get out of here, and you got to get to our sponsors. So
Yes, indeed. So think about it as part of the process or the ritual, a ritual that
exactly,
is embedded in the process of human relationships. Here, building them and maintaining the human relationships in business settings and also in everyday life settings.
sure.
Yes. Okay, so thank you, Tim, for that. And yes, we are past 9 o'clock now, and it's time, of course, to say thank you to both sponsors this time, uh, who make this possible for us. Kanagawa Chuo Jutaku, or Kanchu. You can find them at kanachu.com. And James Howell is there. He can talk with you about any projects you might have in buying and selling real estate in Tokyo and Yokohama, property management and investment property as well. And Houze, you can find them at Houze Inc. online, and Hana is there, Hana Uroshizawa Howell. You will find their contact details in the description of the video on YouTube, or if you are on LinkedIn, just reach out and connect with them if you haven't done that yet. So thanks a lot. We'll be here once again on Sunday at 8:20, and then next week we'll actually have the Wednesday morning podcast, and we'll start a new one about entertainment in Japan. So that's all for the moment. Thanks a lot. Have a great midweek, and enjoy the rest of the week as well.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and for listening. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great. See you next time.